Welcome to Horror Makes Us Happy, the podcast where we ask the question, what is it about horror that makes us happy? And we ask it very creepily like that, slow gait and tone. Your hosts are Steve Becker and myself, Chris Whitman, and you can find out more about us at our website, horrormakesushappy.com. Before we get started, this is the trigger warning. This is a horror podcast. We're going to be talking about horror culture and horror things, so we could delve into sensitive subjects such as the R word, the F word, and other bombs of all kinds of things. And we do talk about dark stuff on this show, but it's not all about the dark stuff. It's just potential. It's mostly a fun psychological experiment to delve into what it is people like about horror and why they like horror. And it's fun. Right, Steve?
Of course. We try to make it fun. Let's see what's going on. We've got we're still doing the listen parties at 7:00 on Sundays, streaming episodes of our podcast on Discord. Also, Chris does a live stream of him working on his horror themed webcomic Pieces of Flesh. I guess the webcomic is called Pieces, but the website is piecesofflesh.com.
Yes.
You can also find my book, A Guide to the Recovery Toolbox, on Amazon and all kinds of other places that sell books.
Oh, yeah, my webcomic's on Global Comics now. It's a little bit better of an interface.
Cool. We've got still a number of people on the guest list and adding more, so I won't go through that. But today we are talking to Mr. Joe R. Lansdale, author best known for his works Bubba, Ho-Tep, Hap and Leonard, and Love, Death, and Robots. Got some stuff going on there, and many other things, actually. Before we get into the meat of the interview, Joe, you want to let us know what you're currently working on?
Yeah, I'm currently working on a new Hap and Leonard novel, and I hope to have it finished by summer. And I have one coming out this summer called Sugar on the Bones. It's also Hap and Leonard.
Well, now I got to finish watching the show. Does it pick up right after the show, or is it more of a continuation of the novel series?
Well, the novels were the first three. The TV show was the first three novels. So they did, each season was based on one of my novels.
Okay.
So there's 13 of them right now, and I'm working on the 14th. So
so you've got a lot more to catch up on.
Yeah, I haven't only did the series, only did the first three.
I was just more impressed by the number. Sir, you write a lot of stuff.
I'm a busy boy.
Yeah.
I don't write that much. I just write regularly.
Yes.
Good. That's how you do it. Stay at it. Stay regular.
Yes.
I'm trying myself, but
yeah. Don't rely on motivation. Just make a habit of it.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't. Well, that's the motivation. I get up every morning. I do it. I've been doing it for 50 years. And somewhere in there, I guess after I'd been doing it for about, I don't know, maybe 12, 13 years, I realized I had to find a method that worked for me. So I worked about 3 hours a day, and I work regularly 7 days a week unless something rare comes along to disturb it.
Right. Cool. Well, the sort of gist of our podcast, what we do, I don't remember how much I shared with you before, so I'll just briefly restate. We will talk about your love of the genre from childhood through adulthood, and then if any reoccurring topics keep coming up, then we might talk about that at the end. Yeah. But starting with childhood, what are some of your earliest memories of scary things?
Well, I think probably for me, it was comic books originally, and at the same time watching old television shows. And the comic books and the television shows led me to reading more horror. And that's how I started reading Poe. And I was very young. I mean, I started reading comics when I was 4. They weren't horror comics, but I moved over to other kinds of comics relatively quick. And so, I've loved all the old Universal films and a lot of the Roger Corman films. And, they got me started. Classics Illustrated caused me to read all kinds of things, and some of those were horror related, like Frankenstein or Dracula.
Do you remember, how can I say this? Do you remember what the first horror, like real, don't want to use the phrase real horror, but like, do you remember what your first experience with horror was as a kid?
Probably Poe. My mother, perhaps not knowing any better, gave me a big book of Poe's stories and poems when I was probably about 7 or 8. And I was kind of precocious. I was already a reader. And so I think that probably The Telltale Heart, Black Cat, and Premature Burial, all those I read pretty much back to back. So those, I think, sort of nailed down my love for horror, and then causing me to look for more and seeking it out. On TV, the thing that scared the hell out of me was on Thriller was Pigeons from Hell by Robert E. Howard. They did an adaptation of that. Boris Karloff introduced the show each week, and that for many years I think was one of the creepiest things that ever been on TV until TV began to be more open, and you had better effects and things like that, and the haunting, the original in the 60s, based on the haunting of Hill House, also was another killer. Those I saw all those on TV.
Cool. I've never heard of that Pigeons from Hell thing before. That's interesting.
Oh my gosh, you know who Robert E. Howard is, don't you?
The name rings a bell.
Conan.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, plus lots of other stuff. But he wrote lots of horror stories for Weird Tales, which was the preeminent pulp magazine for horror stories. And it was adapted along with works by Robert Bloch, who I hope you know. He wrote Psycho and tons of short stories related to horror and crime as well, and different things. But this series, Thriller, was in the 60s. And although it also did some sort of mundane crime stories, the best of it was when they started adapting horror stories like Pigeons from Hell and Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper by Bloch, and so on.
Apparently there's a graphic novel adaptation of Pigeons from Hell.
Yes, I did one.
Oh, nice.
And there was one before that, which is better than mine. But the one I did was kind of a sequel where the similar events would reoccur. But there was one that was a very literal adaptation that I thought was really terrific. I can't remember who did it at the moment, but years later they wanted me to do something a little more updated, and so I did it for, which I think it was, who was it? Was it IDW or Dark Horse? I can't recall. But one of those.
I think I saw a Dark Horse emblem. Yeah, I just Googled it, and it says right here, Pigeons from Hell from Joe R. Lansdale. This is the one you did.
Okay. Yeah.
I like the art.
I did Conan, which is also, so in other words, that's a double dose of Robert E. Howard. I've written some introductions and articles about Robert Howard. So, he was prominent as both a horror writer and an adventure writer.
You know what? I just had a light bulb go off. The ones you did for Conan, was that back in the 90s?
I can't remember. Maybe in the early 2000s. It was Songs of the Dead, and I did 4 issues, and they were put into one collection. I did them with Tim Truman.
Okay, no, that I don't think that was the one that I read, because they right around the late 90s, early 2000s, I did buy some. They were like thick spine Conan books that were painted covers, I think maybe by Frazetta. God, I haven't thought about those in years. I wonder if I still have those buried.
Probably wouldn't have been Frazetta then. Frazetta certainly did covers for the books and comics and things like that, but these were a little later.
I might still have those buried in the back of my closet. I'll have to go dig those out.
You could, yeah.
Let's see. Okay, so Poe, Telltale Heart, Black Cat, and what was the third one you mentioned?
The Premature Burial.
Ah, yes. And
he also invented the detective genre with his stories about Dupin. He was the first detective story writer, so I read all of that stuff, just consumed it.
Yeah, my I also got a copy of Poe's work pretty early, although not as early as you. I think I got mine in actually, you know what? Now I think it might have been because I was in 3rd or 4th grade. So that would have been
7 or 8,
9 or 10. Yeah.
Well, my mother always wanted me to read. My dad couldn't read or write. He was a mechanic, and my mother had maybe an 11th grade education. And so they are always supportive of me reading. And so I read constantly, and I still do. I'm a little less these days, but on the whole, I'm very much a heavy reader. Hardly a day passes that I'm not reading. But I used to put away a book a day, and then later 3 or 4 books a week. And then it was 2 books a week. And that's, I'm sort of at maybe now 1 book a week.
Yeah, I have dwindled as well, although now I'm more down to none, if I'm being honest.
Well, I'm picking up again. I had some things going on that changed my life a little bit, and so it caused me to read a little less for a while.
I can relate to that too. Going back to the stuff you mentioned, Telltale Heart, what did you like about that one?
Well, for me, I mean, when you first discover horror, everything is new. And the idea that this guy imagined that he could hear the heart of the guy he had murdered beating beneath the floorboards was pretty scary. And the premature burial, the whole idea of being put into the ground and not being able to, get out and people not know that you're not dead, but that you just got buried alive, when people thinking you're dead. And the black cat, and also the one I really liked was Cast of Amontillado, which was a very creepy. And there's another one of those things where someone is walled in alive. I must have been one of Poe's worries was about being, claustrophobic, being put in a coffin or being walled in. All that stuff popped up in his stories a lot.
Yeah. Do you remember what horror comic books you read when you were a kid?
When I was a kid, there weren't many horror comic books per se, but a lot of the early superhero comics, of Batman being one in particular, sometimes they touched on horror themes. I wouldn't exactly call them horror comics, but those elements were there. And that was true of a lot of superhero things because you were dealing with the fantastic. But when I read Classics Illustrated, they sometimes adapted the Poe stories, or they adapted Frankenstein, or they adapted Dracula. So those were early on for me to lead me to read the books. So that's what they were. They were usually pretty, I would say, accurate adaptations of the novel. Sometimes they would have to pull something out, but those really got me wanting to read the original story. So for that, I owe them much. And I owe that to my career because when I was a kid and I was given comics, I was 4. I knew immediately I wanted to write comics and draw them. I wasn't thinking of it like a career. I mean, as a kid, I didn't know what a career was. I just knew that that's what I wanted to do. There was something there that appealed to me. And I think it was storytelling primarily.
Yeah.
Because I've done horror, but I've done a lot more crime. I've done historicals. I've done Westerns. Horror is just one edge of my career.
Right.
Any horror Westerns? Yeah,
I've written Westerns. I have one coming out with Peter Dinklage and Juliette Lewis sometime in the near future.
Awesome.
The one that's coming out is called The Thicket.
The Thicket. Let me ask you Pigeons from Hell, because I wanted to go back to that too. What was the story on that? What did you like about that?
Well, I mean, it was a scary story, but I liked it because it was a Southern scary story. And it even has an element of the Western in it, because the sheriff who begins to investigate the death of this guy's buddy at this old house out in the river bottoms of Louisiana is somebody that can draw a pistol. He said he could draw a pistol faster than a cat could jump. And so there were elements of all kinds of things in that story. And I read the story later because I saw the adaptation first, and it scared the hell out of me, and that I think that even more encouraged me to get involved with horror. I think thriller was a big, fuel for that, because they did so many of horror tales and a lot of Robert Bloch. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper, is a classic story of his, and they did an adaptation there. I actually did a comic book adaptation of it with my brother for IDW, and I did another one with him of Bloch stories called The Hellbound Train. So I've done a lot of comic books. I couldn't even tell you how many, and I've done a number of them that are horror pieces.
But specifically, what was it about Pigeons from Hell that scared you? Is what I was getting at.
Well, it had to do with kind of a zombie in a way. And the idea, I think what scared me was the old haunted house, 2 guys that were in Louisiana, which is just right across the border from me. And to think that, oh man, you can have horror stories that take place in your own environment or something similar to your environment, I think was highly appealing. It wasn't just a castle in Europe, it was this place where something is creepy in this house and something is coming down the stairs. And that really affected me. And there were things like 13 Ghosts later and things, and an old movie called The Uninvited with Ray Milland that was made in 40s or early 50s. So there were so many things, but I think I like the creep factor more than anything else.
Okay. So more of a atmosphere.
Yeah. Atmosphere, creep factor. And, it had a hatchet in the head, so it didn't avoid that either. So at that time, it was not particularly bloody, but you imagined it was. I mean, when I saw it again, I really liked it still, but I realized too that my imagination had filled in a lot of it, and I think that's what they intended.
Yeah. Did you dress up for Halloween as a kid?
Oh yeah, loved it. Yeah, we used to go door to door back then. We just go the whole community. The community watched after you when I was young, and I would usually be Casper the Ghost because they had a cheap outfit that you could get with a Casper mask and a kind of a white, little uniform shirt and stuff. So I was Casper the Ghost at least 2 years.
Did you have a favorite costume?
That one.
Okay.
Casper.
No, because it was my first one I remember, and I was a kid, and Halloween was fun back then. You didn't have to worry about somebody doing this or that, or at least you weren't aware of it if you needed to worry about it.
Yeah. Did you have a least favorite costume as a kid?
No.
Okay.
They're all good.
All right.
Good answer.
Any scary dreams as a kid? Recurring nightmares?
I never been a big nightmare person, but weirdly enough, the Brides of Dracula gave me some nightmares, and I saw that, and I'm not really sure why that one hit me because I'd seen other things and nothing, and I always enjoyed them, and they scared me in the moment, and I could think back on them and have a delicious feeling of terror. But that one, when I came home, I got some bobby pins and made a cross. And I'm an atheist, but back then we were going to, we were Baptists, and I got a little string and put that damn cross around my neck because I was afraid that Dracula might come through the window and get me, and so I had nightmares about that, and that's about the only nightmare I ever remember having. I had a couple of minor ones when I was older, which I turned into stories.
Okay, we can talk about that when we get to that section. Did you have anything in real life scare you as a child?
Well, there were moments when you were in the woods and you would come across a snake, a water moccasin. That was kind of scary. But you mean in the broader sense like that? Not really, no.
Okay. I
wasn't a very fearful child.
Understandable. I mean, there's going to be questions that we ask that may not land for you. You have to ask because you never know.
Sure, that's okay.
Flipping that question around, was there ever a time in your childhood when you felt specifically like really completely like bliss, happy, safe?
Yeah, most of my childhood, I had a really good childhood. I've had a really good life. It's not that, you live long enough, you're going to have some tragedy in your life or things that don't go well, but I never have been a depressive person. I'm happy just about all the time. I love just being alive. To me, this is like the greatest gift ever. And I'm not expecting a happy hunting ground when I die. I figure this is it, and I think it's given me a greater desire to really live life and do what I can to enjoy it. So. No, I don't remember that. Like I said, you have your moments when something happens and you're depressed, but you know why, or that you're sad and you know why, and it passes. But I never really was that a problem. No.
Okay.
I found out I was kind of an anomaly. The more people I talked to, I had no idea that so many people felt unhappy and miserable. And, we were poor. I mean, they used to say, my dad used to say, if it cost a quarter to shit, we'd have to throw up. And
Good. I like that.
We didn't really think ourselves poor so much as we thought of ourselves as broke. Broke was psychologically different. It meant there were going to be better days. And sometimes there were. And we had different periods in our life where things were pretty good. But the thing that I think helped and kept that from being a real burden is nearly everybody around us was the same way. They were in the same boat. We all had a hole in our boat and we were bailing as fast as we could, and I worked all sorts of jobs, as I got older, like, in high school, I worked aluminum chair plant. I worked for the street department in the summers, and I did mobile homes. I had with my wife and I had a goat dairy, and we raised all we ate. We did everything. I can't even tell you how many different jobs I had. But, by the time I was 29, I was a full-time writer, and I haven't done anything since. I teach martial arts still. I've been doing that all my life since I was about 11.
You brought up something unexpected that might be worth asking about. So you mentioned, teaching martial arts since you were about 11.
Well, I'm not teaching at 11. I started at 11.
Understood. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's still, I mean, if you started taking it at 11,
yes,
doing some quick math in the back of my head, that's
1 year.
pretty, I mean, that's pretty early compared to, how can I say this? Martial arts wasn't a very widely known thing in the U.S.
My father was a boxer and a wrestler. And so that was my first exposure. He also, during the Great Depression, because he was 42 when I was born, during the Great Depression, he rode the rails from town to town and boxed in fairs and wrestled in fairs. It was kind of the beginning of what later became professional wrestling. And he had picked up a lot of judo type throws or jujitsu techniques. And so I learned from him first. And then when I was about 13, the YMCA in Tyler, Texas, I think I was about 13, I started training in judo there. And then a few years later, there was something, I guess it was probably about 65, there was Hapkido, which had only been in the U.S. for about 2 years. It's not an ancient art. It's based on some ancient arts. And then while I was there at at YMCA, because we had a Tyler Junior College there, so people were cycling through, I was able to study Thai boxing, Kempo. We had some people that came to our high school from Thailand that was during the Vietnam War, and there were people from Thailand coming here, and some of them were Thai boxers, so I started with them and trained with them. And I did Taekwondo at the YMCA for a while, and I got into studying just everything I could come across. And I was very fortunate because no matter where I ended up, I always seemed to find someone that was pretty damn good at their art. And I began to acquire quite a bit of knowledge. And after I'd been doing it for quite in my 40s, I started my own system called Shin Chuan. And it was it and me are in the United States Martial Arts Hall of Fame.
Nice. So you started it at 11. Did you, how can I say this? Were you thinking of it in terms of self-defense at that time, or was it more just
I think that's the main reason I started. Batman made me want to do it because in the Batman comics, he did judo and jujitsu and different arts. Once in a while, they'd be mentioned, and he would do like a technique or something, throw somebody or box somebody. And I thought, wow, I'd like to do that. But I had no idea about my father. My mother told me. And it turned out he was like a legitimate badass. And so he started teaching me those things, and I was really interested in them. And he worked hard, so he wasn't always able to teach me every day, but he gave me a lot of boxing exercises and different kinds of drills and things which I would do on my own because I was very dedicated. And then he showed me a lot of wrestling stuff, groundwork, as we used to call it. And he knew just a little bit of judo because the thing is, a lot of people had picked that stuff up, even in the 30s. In fact, jiu-jitsu was popular. Theodore Roosevelt studied jiu-jitsu.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, he brought in some people to train with, some Japanese experts to train with, and he studied wrestling. And if I remember correctly, the guy who taught him jiu-jitsu eventually moved to Brazil, and he was the source of Brazilian jiu-jitsu that was later
Gracie's or Grayson's?
They took it over and did their own modifications, but he was the guy. And I think he taught the old man,
Wow.
Interesting.
But most arts really aren't that pure. They're all mixed with other things because people pick up things, they acquire things, they do this, they do that. And it modifies the art sometimes, and sometimes to the detriment. But if it's good people, it's just the opposite. Bruce Lee came along. He just kind of said, screw all that. Let's look at this.
So I make my own martial arts with blackjack and hookers.
Yeah. But anyway, martial arts have been a big part of my life.
Yeah.
Awesome.
These next two questions are going to be asked as a pair. I'm going to start with a negative one first so we can end on the positive one.
All right.
Do you remember the first person you hurt?
Wait, physically or emotionally or?
Either one.
Or.
Well, probably my mother because I didn't want to do something she wanted me to do. I remember it was a funny thing because I was growing up. my mother never spanked me, and my father never did either. Well, I'm going to make an exception for my mother in a minute, but they weren't like that. My father his mother died when he was 8. He was born in 1909, and when he was 8 years old, his mother died, and his father would make him go to work in the cotton fields. In fact, would use a whip on him.
Oof.
He was scarred and cut up from that whip, but he never laid a hand on me. And my mother, one time, and this was, talk about herder. I must have done something. I was mean as hell. I don't even remember what it is now, but I got a fly swatter whipping that I really, really deserved.
As long as you deserved it, that's the important
part. I
part.
must have stepped over that line. And, you hurt people all the time without even knowing it, I guess. But I've never intentionally went out to do that. And when I was growing up in Gladewater, I actually did have to fight a lot. So physically, I hurt quite a few people, but it was either me be hurt or they be hurt.
Right. Do you remember the first person you helped?
No, I've always been helpful or tried to be, that puts you in the light of saying, look what a good guy I am. But I think I've always been kind and generous, or at least I've tried to be. I mean, it's not really up to me to judge. Other people are probably going, what an asshole.
As long as you think you're kind, that's
I mean, frankly, I think those are silly questions, but that's the best I can answer.
Well, here's the thing. So you'd be surprised what those kinds of things trigger. And then sometimes the memories that they trigger might hold some sort of emotional connection for you.
Like I said, I'm not getting anything from those questions because they're so general. If we were talking about certain things, I might go, oh yeah, and this happened. But I think that's all I got on those, man.
That's fair. Like I said, not everyone's going to land.
Yeah.
Moving into teenage years, what kind of scary books or stories or movies do you remember from your teenage years?
Oh, all the Roger Corman stuff. I'd been seeing it on TV, and there were new ones. We would later on, when I got older, I went to the drive-in theater, and I would see anything that had horror in it or science fiction. I always thought I was going to be a science fiction writer when I was young. And as I grew older, I did end up writing science fiction, but mostly as short stories. But I love the mixture of horror and science fiction. And so, Day of the Triffids or whatever that was related to something of that nature that had both elements in it, science fiction and horror, I loved it. And we went to the drive-in all the time when I was a teenager. Some of the movies I missed because I had a date and we had other things in mind. But I can't tell you how many movies I saw. I saw Night of the Living Dead at the drive-in. I saw the Texas Chainsaw Massacre at a drive-in. You name it, I saw it there at different drive-ins. Some of those in Tyler, some in Longview. There was when I was growing up and I was a child, we lived across the highway from a drive-in theater, but there was a honky-tonk on our side. So you saw a lot of things going on in the parking lot of the honky tonk, and you could watch the drive-in over the roof of the honky tonk because of our house set up on a hill. And so my mother would have me watch cartoons, and we would watch those, sit in chairs by the windows, which seemed gigantic to me. They were probably just regular windows. And my mother would tell me what the cartoon people were saying, like this is what Bugs Bunny's saying, and this is what so-and-so's saying, because we couldn't hear it, obviously. It was just visual. And then later when I got older, I thought, and I saw those cartoons, I thought, well, God damn it, my mom was a liar. They weren't saying that.
She's just making it up like, oh yeah, Bugs is ordering some coffee and
yeah, right. Yeah, Bugs ordered some coffee and it was but those were great times, and my mother was always good about trying to entertain me. My dad was out working. He was on the road sometimes. And, I've told this story before, but I'll try to briefly tell it. But when I was about 4 or 5, I'm about 4, my dad thought, that I might be lonely because really I liked being by myself, but he got me a dog, and it was a puppy. And he called it Honky Tonk because he got it from the Honky Tonk. Some dog had puppies out back of the Honky Tonk, and people ended up getting puppies, and he ended up getting one for me. And I called him Blackie. And me and that dog, man, we were close. We like brothers. We drank out of the same water bowl. And we shared everything, candy bars even, which is supposed to be the death of dogs, but we did do that. And because we didn't know that back then. And one day, me and the dog wandered up the hill, and there was a house behind us. It was even a little higher up, but there was also kind of like a ditch of water or a little creek or something. I don't remember exactly, but we went across that up to his house where all these flowers were blooming in the in this bed around his house, all the way around, like a little horseshoe around it, really. And my dog immediately started digging in the flower bed. And which I was thinking about doing it myself. But this guy came out of the house all of a sudden, jerked my puppy up by the hind legs and hit it in the back of the head with either a stick or a pipe or something, and threw it in the creek. And I went home crying, and my mom called my dad, and I don't really know how long it took him to be there, but it seemed pretty quick. I think he was probably close by at that time, because that black car came up, it was like Mr. Death had arrived, and he got out of it and he told me, "You stay here." And of course, immediately I did not stay there. As soon as he went up, I followed. That was my dog. And when we got up to the hill, he knocked on that guy's door. And when he answered it, he hit that guy so hard, he just knocked him plain out. And then he grabbed him by the ankles and took him out and dragged him through all of his flowers. And then he got him by the ankles and threw him in the creek. Then he went down to a dog, which was still alive. And that dog died when I was 17. And, but my father, I guess I should have known what a badass he was, because I was 4 when that happened. And I've never seen anybody get, there was one other instance where he did, which was his hardest hit I ever saw. But man, that guy if he was awake, he pretended he wasn't. It was kind of like if a grizzly bear gets you by the leg, you just got to go with it. And that's what he did. My dad was not a huge man, but he was like unnaturally strong. And I think that's because he'd had to work since he was a child, and we went through the Great Depression and, boxing, wrestling, and fairs for money. So he and my mom could have, extra money, that sort of thing. Anyway, I remember that a lot about the drive-in theater I remember the drive-in theater and the honky tonk, where I learned a lot of really good language from hearing people cuss and yell out in the park. And there were people out there having fights. They were knocking knots on each other's head faster than you could count them, and it should have been my dad, one punch, go to sleep. But it was an interesting childhood, to say the least. And a tornado came through there not long after that, and wadded up the drive-in screen and tore the roof off the honky tonk while we hid in a next door neighbor's storm cellar. And you could hear that thing. I thought it was funny. I told my friend Bill Paxton, when he was in Twister, and I told him, I said, that thing where the guy's in there and you can see the door rattling. That's exactly.
I've been through that personally.
Exactly what it was. And when we went in there, and I was a kid, my mom, the guy kind of met us as we were running over there, because we just decided we're going in your storm shelter. And because you could see the damn thing dip down and it's like the Wizard of Oz. And within seconds, we were running across to his storm cellar. But when we got inside, the whole thing was filled with water. And we were just on the steps. And I think some of them were on like little benches or something. I can't remember. And there was a snake in the water. And then the lights went out. Whatever battery he had or whatever rig he had, it was done. And he had just started trying to fight that snake with a stick or something.
I was about to ask, did the lights go out just after you discovered the snake? Like, of course they did.
Only thereafter, yeah. He was fighting it in the water and the lights went out. And when the lights came back on, or either maybe the storm passed, and we opened the cellar door and came out, he had killed the snake. He had managed somehow to kill the snake. And I don't remember much else about that. That memory is pretty solid. I mean, I think all memories are you should distrust to some degree, because you can't remember everything, and your age at which you experience something colors that experience, Yeah. I'm writing a memoir right now, so I'm fully aware of that. But it's it was an interesting experience. And I've noticed that in my work, those storms, dogs, people defending themselves or trying to set matters right tend to be in just about everything I write.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme. Also, right from life, you know?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Day of the Triffids.
Yep.
What'd you like about,
How
that one?
Scary plants, man. And you got, I always liked the idea of stories, like John Wyndham wrote several that I liked, but I always liked the idea of somebody sort of waking up and the world has changed and they don't understand why, but it's changed dramatically. And to me, that's a real horror. It can be a delicious horror, and if it really happened, it wouldn't be any fun at all. But the Triffids I just found were really scary in the book, and in the movie at that time, I was the same. They seem a little sillier now at this point in time, but I'd sure love to see somebody. It's been remade, but I'd love to see somebody do a really serious remake of Day of the Triffids.
Yeah,
those plants, they can make you go blind. And most everybody was blind except the hero, for example, and some others. There were reasons they didn't go blind when they were looking up at what they thought were meteorites, not stars. They went blind from it. So people were easy victims for these plants, which could move around. They would pull up the roots and move around. And the hero was in the hospital, and I think he was in for eye surgery, if I remember right. And he was bound up, so he didn't see all the lights. And he had been disappointed when people said, yeah, there's going to be this big meteor shower. And he thought, well, I didn't get to see it. But he was one of the few that lucked out.
So I suppose the world changing dramatically would also be a common theme with Night of the Living Dead.
Yes. One of my favorite. I guess, it's funny. My favorite horror films tend to be much quieter ones usually. But Night of the Living Dead and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre are both, I love both of those so much. And Night of the Living Dead, the original, is still my favorite, though I like some of the other things in that series. But that one was in black and white. I went to the drive-in. Yeah, what's this? With holy shit,
right?
Yeah. And at that time, it seemed so graphic, compared to now, maybe it wouldn't seem that way. But you look out there and here's a zombie eating somebody's leg or arm or something.
Yeah, and they used actual real chicken flesh, if I recall correctly, or pork flesh. So it looked real because they were eating real meat.
Right. I actually worked kind of related to George Romero twice. When the Book of the Dead was done, it was dedicated to him. So all of us were working in his tradition. And I wrote on the far side of the Cadillac Desert with Dead Folks. And that won some awards. It's still around. It's constantly reprinted. And that was all influenced by George and his, what he had created. And then years later, I wrote a story for a thing that he and Jonathan Mayberry edited. And I wrote a zombie story for that called Dead Man's Curve.
So what do you like about Texas Chainsaw? Because that one's a little bit different. It's not
funny. It's funny.
It's funny.
Yeah, okay. It's very funny. I think
specifically too. One has its funny moments too.
Yeah, it's a dark comedy. I think it had lots of funny moments. I think even with the one with Leatherface chasing with a chainsaw, almost not being able to make the corner, and. So to me, it's both. And the horror I like tends to have some elements of humor. That's not always true. I don't think of Night of the Living Dead as a laugh fest by any means. Right. But I did think that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was funny.
I didn't mean to say that it's not. I was just amused that was the first thing you went to, because I don't think anybody's ever gone to that first when they talk about that movie.
Well, certainly it was scary too. It had other, and what made it scary is that, especially when I was young like that, you didn't see a whole lot of horror that was dealing with real horror. You would see the zombies had been changed into zombies for something that we didn't understand. And then you had supernatural stuff. But when I saw
like vampires, werewolves, but this is like serial killers, people in real life that could happen.
Weird people living in the backwoods. And it was filmed in Texas, and it certainly had a Texas feel to it. And I enjoyed it a lot for that, but I also just thought, wow, this is truly scary, because the other things were deliciously scary, and this one was really creepy scary, because you could think, you know what? There's some people out there that are a bubble off the plum, and these are examples, you know.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've heard that's really stuck with me about Texas Chainsaw was people used to say, don't go into the city because there's scary, crazy shit in there. And Texas Chainsaw flipped the script where it made people think, well, maybe there's terrors that you should be afraid of in the country, too.
Absolutely. And a lot of my stories are about that. I always say there's more goes on in the country than you suspect. And my wife was a dispatcher, crime dispatcher for the both the fire department before 911, and then both the fire department and the police department for about 10 years. And she heard some of the most incredible stories. And my son did the same job for about 7 years. And it was tending to be the same families that were always killing people or getting in trouble or being dangerous. And I always thought of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, how it was a family tradition.
Yeah, that's one of the difficult things about, one of the disconnects in our current discussion around, our gun situation here in America is that one of the things that I think is difficult is that, there's this difference between urban and rural that, you can't even necessarily define it by state level or federal level, because even within the state, you've got some areas that are rural and some areas that are urban, and having different situations with, either gun accessibility or whatnot, like you say, out in the country, things can happen and there's nobody out there to protect you but you. And so that's a much different situation than being in an urban situation.
True, but I still don't think they need weapons that can, kill 5,000 people. Or I have a shotgun, and and it's all I need. And I used to hunt squirrels with it when we used to have food that to add to our larder. We weren't hunting for fun. My father never said hunting is not a sport unless they're shooting back. And so I have a shotgun that's taking care of me for like poisonous snakes. My rule is poisonous snakes are fine. I'm nothing against them unless they're in my yard. And I don't want to walk up on one or want my children to back then, or my wife or my dog. So I had that. And if someone were to want to come through the door, that shotgun is fine. You don't need all those other weapons. I mean, you just don't need that much firepower, I guess.
No, I completely agree. But what I'm getting at is, and what you're talking about here is nuance. And what I'm saying is there are shades of nuance between rural versus urban that don't really get to be part of the conversation.
No, it's very much so. And I actually agree with you. I think that's the thing, is that nobody really talks about these things because nobody wants to do nuance. Right. And a lot of the people I know in the country, though, have weapons far more powerful than they would need to defend their home or kill a deer or whatever it is they think they might need to do to eat. Most hunters I know don't really hunt to eat these days. We did. Mm-hmm. They spend a lot of money so they can go out and kill an animal and smear blood on them and think they've done like this major, battle with a lion. And to me, I'm not opposed to hunting to eat, but I'm kind of opposed to people that spend a tremendous amount of money to go out and just shoot a deer, and the money they spent, they could have bought enough meat for 2 years.
Yeah. I definitely have much more respect for bow hunters.
Yeah. I get that too, but you're also a bow hunter. You can really hit an animal and injure them more easily, and not die or cause them to die very slowly. So you better be a damn good bow hunter. Yeah.
Yes. Let's see. Other questions for teenage years. Was there any time in your teenage years where you were terrified of something in real life?
One time, me and a bunch of other assholes decided we were going to
always starts that way.
Yeah, some people from out of town. We were going to chase them out of town with the car, which was idiotic. And all they did, we were just they were running ahead of us, and we were running them. And the guy all of a sudden just pulled up in this spot of this house, and his father comes out with a shotgun, and he pointed that shotgun right at me, and I said, "I'm an idiot." to myself. Said, and that was a lesson learned too. Because, we were just all playing, but I felt like, it doesn't take much to get your ass killed. So you need to use the best judgment possible. And that really scared me. And then, of course, when things happen to my family or things like that, that scares me in a different way and on a different level. But that idea of true fear, that those two barrels, like looking down two subway tunnels.
Yeah.
Yeah, we diffused it, but it was close.
Well,
and we deserved it. We were the assholes.
The important thing there is that you learn something.
Yes, learn something. I don't want to get shot with a shot.
No, sir.
I hear it hurts.
Only for a little while.
Yeah.
Was there any time in your teens when you felt exceptionally happy?
Most of the time. I enjoyed just getting up and being alive. I had friends, and I read, and I was athletic, but I only was interested in martial arts. That's the only athletics I ever liked. I never cared for football or basketball. I liked baseball some, but which I was terrible at. But I don't know. There's not like just a moment, because I've just felt like I have lived in some ways a charmed life, even with certain tragedies, and I have had some, but overall, I feel really content. It's the best way I know to say it.
No, that's legitimate.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's roll into adult years then. So, and I understand this is probably a larger swath of your lifetime, but if you were to pick, maybe the first two or three things that come to mind in terms of what has been impactful to you in the horror genre as an adult, what are the first things that come to mind?
I think the Vietnam War would be. I was opposed to the Vietnam War, but I wasn't opposed as a conscientious objector. But I was in college and I had a deferment. And at some point I got a divorce from my first wife. And I also was having a hard time getting back in college. I didn't have a lot of money. And I just decided, you know what? I'm not going to this war. I don't believe in it. And I was drafted. My number was 28 because I was kind of between trying to get back into college. But I think just made up my mind that I was trying to make some idealistic statement, which because when you're young, you're a lot more idealistic. And so I was drafted, but I refused to go. And I almost went to prison. And I was supposed to go. It would have been like 18 months. But after all of my, examination, and everything, they sent me home actually and told me to come back in 2 weeks. And, I knew what was going to happen in 2 weeks when I came back. And when I got back to Dallas, they had a bus that would pick you up in Tyler because they were drafting people. I came in, the guys talked to me a few minutes, same guys. They said, and, they'd given me tests, both physical and mental, and he said, okay, go talk to our psychiatrist. And I was in there about 10 minutes and he gave me a 1Y, which means unfit for military service. And they sent me home. And I was stunned all the way home on the bus.
Like on the one hand, good, don't want it anyway. But on the other hand, why?
Yeah. And, but the Vietnam War was a very terrifying thing that you could see it on TV at night. People were dying and whatever. And, I believe there's some wars worth fighting. I'd have fought in World War II. If I'd have lived then and I wouldn't even had to been drafted. I would have volunteered. But I thought that this war was wrong. I still do. My brother's came out a captain. He went into the military because he's 17 years older than me. When I was born, he was already pretty much out of the house. So we didn't grow up together. We always joked that we were both only children. And we didn't see eye to eye on that one, but we're close. We're not like, estranged or anything. I see him all the time, talk to him all the time. He's 88. But the war was something that to me was pretty horrible, and I think it was horrible all around. And I think it was obviously wrong because Vietnam turned out to be one of our greatest trade partners and people go there now for vacation. So it didn't turn into this sort of like the domino theory of if Vietnam falls, everything else does, because we invented.
That's a very valid point. The whole reason we went over there supposedly was to stop communism, and we lost. And guess what? Communism didn't happen.
Yeah, well, what happened is they're still communists by name, but they're really more like capitalists. It's a very, that's what they do. They're a capitalistic country, really, no matter what they say on paper. And, I just felt like this, and that's what I thought was going to happen. And the other thing, too, is we invented the government of South Korea. There was no government opposing North Korea. We just sort of, Vietnam. We just decided that we would do that. And we put a guy in charge that I think later we helped assassinate. So to me, it was just all such a clusterfuck. And I still think it is. And what I say, the proof's in the pudding. You look at it. And I mean, a lot of soldiers from the U.S. who fought in Vietnam go there for vacation. I find that very, very interesting, very strange, So, and we lost 54,000 people. I mean, there was in the Civil War, there was one day where they lost 54,000, but still, that was a lot of people. And most of those people, didn't volunteer; they were drafted. And it seems like to me it's one of the most useless wars we ever fought. And when people say patriotism, well, patriotism shouldn't be blind. You shouldn't just say, okay, I'm going because I got to be patriotic. And I knew friends of mine that were against the war and went anyway because they couldn't stand up to the idea of being shamed. And I didn't give a shit because I didn't believe in it. And most people left me alone anyway. So that came out fine. And there were a lot of people I knew who also didn't support the war. But the idea of that and what was going on at that time, those were scary times. And used to, because my hair was down to my waist nearly, there was always somebody that wanted to fight and you didn't have any way around it and you had to. Fortunately, I knew how, but it's just, those times had their scary moments, but they were also wonderful times because music was so exciting and changing in the 60s and early 70s. And there were things happening then that had never happened before and never will probably happen again.
Yeah, it was, at least regarding the war, is not one of our shining moments.
No,
the other things going on in the culture, as you say, some of those were.
Yeah.
Other things that were impactful to you regarding horror in your adult years?
Yeah, civil rights. I was very much for civil rights in an area where they weren't for civil rights, where they had water fountains and restrooms designated for white and colored, as they said, when they were polite. Sometimes it didn't say that. And you go to a theater, they had to go upstairs to the balcony. I remember being a pretty young kid. I don't remember exactly how young, but we were going to the Cozy Theater in Gladewater, and I saw a line of black people going up there was another opening at the back, and they went up that opening. And I asked my mom, I said, why are those people having to go up there? And she said, well, I can't explain it, but it's not right, and it won't always be that way. And I thought about it. And as I grew older, I became much more aware because, we weren't aware that we were racist, but it was just the society itself. And the language that people used was pretty ugly at that time, but we didn't even know it was bad language. We just thought that was the common, way of addressing people in general. And I read Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, which made me really realize what racism was. And those people who want to ban it because it has offensive words in it are like fucking idiots, because that book is an anti-racist book. The word itself is not what's important. It's the context. And he taught me so much about that. Then I read To Kill a Mockingbird, the same. And I've had some black friends of mine say, well, yeah, but it wasn't from the black perspective. And my take is that it doesn't have to be. And second of all, white people needed an entry level into understanding what was racist, because when you grow up with something, you don't always see it or understand.
Right. Like you said, when you're immersed in it and you grow up in that environment, you don't know that you're racist. So it was good to have a novel to say, hey, you might be doing this.
Right. I had more reasons to fight because I was for civil rights, and when Martin Luther King was assassinated, that damn near killed me, and John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, all of them. But Martin Luther King was, in some ways, he was holding everything together. And when he died, of course, you started having riots and people being hurt, which is terrible. I could understand the impulse, but I didn't think that was the right answer. And I sort of agreed with him on that matter. But so, yeah, civil rights scared me because there were people being hurt. And when I was a kid, I never saw anything just absolutely terrible, but I did see black people beat up for being black people. I saw some things that I really, wished I didn't see. And, you go to a restaurant and they couldn't go in. They had to go to the back if they allowed that, and they got their food through a little slot at the back, so they didn't have to see their faces. And you yourself, you could go in the front door and sit down and eat, and they couldn't. And that always just hurt me in a sort of a to the bone. I don't know how else to explain it. But civil rights it was a real scar on me and on the South. I mean, I never felt guilty for it myself because I never supported it from the time I understood, what was going on. And, but I always felt responsible. And a lot of my work deals with civil rights, even though it's maybe a horror story or a crime story or whatever, because I was affected by the social aspect of the 60s. And when I did go to college, I never finished. I majored in anthropology and archaeology. And things like that, and history. But, those things are actually dealing with human beings, and they affect you in different ways and giving you different ways of seeing what's going on. So there were a variety of things like that made me have a different view of civil rights. And of course, it wasn't just in the South, but the South was probably the worst because of Jim Crow.
Prominent anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. I gotta say though, back when you were first starting to talk about the civil rights and racism, when you mentioned when you asked your mother why those people were in a different line, I like her answer. That
I do too.
Well, it's just the way it is, but it won't always be this way. It's rather.
Yeah, it's not right. Now, my dad was the opposite. He was, and he's my hero, but he was very racist. But he was racist in word. And I remember when we would go hunting or fishing, we went for food. Like my dad always said, if you ever enjoy seeing something fall or think I've killed something and makes you a big man, you need to sit on a log there and talk to yourself. And, but we would always kill more squirrels than we needed, and he would go give them to black families that he knew because he worked on their cars at the garage. And he would do the same thing with fishing. Said, we need to go give this to so-and-so, and because, I think they're a little short on food or whatever. So you can't, I think we're going through a period where everybody sees things in black and white, and they aren't in black and white. Everything has shading and degrees, and I think that's important to understand, or otherwise you never really look at anything from a perspective where you can kind of figure out why a person thinks a certain way and why they act a certain way and why you might be able to influence them differently, or how you might be influenced yourself by learning more about them. And I don't think we do that much. When I was growing up, writing was straightforward. There wasn't a bunch of people trying to say, well, don't say this word or that word. It was the context that mattered. And I don't pay attention to those people anyway, but it was the context that mattered. What am I saying? And I was always writing stuff that was very pro-civil rights. And when I wrote about the past, I definitely was saying, look, this is what happened. Let's don't sugarcoat this shit. Let's show it for what it is. It's ugly. And if you're offended by the fact that it's ugly, then that's not the same thing. And don't misunderstand a story that contains races for a racist story. They're not necessarily the same thing.
As you said, nuance.
Yeah. I mean, Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn, definitely anti-racist. I got it when I was a kid. There's when Huck says that he was supposed to turn Jim in because that was a Christian thing to do. That's what he'd been taught, that slaves, escaped slaves, you were supposed to turn them in. He says, I know I'm supposed to turn Jim in, but you know what? He's my friend and I know it's wrong, but I'm just going to go to hell. So he wouldn't turn him in, because it was his friend. But there was a lesson in there that Twain was trying to tell us, that this Christian viewpoint doesn't make much sense if that's how you judge Christians. In other words, if you're supposed to return your slaves, he didn't think that was what he wanted to do, even though in his own naive way, he thought, well, that may be right. That's what we're supposed to do as Christians, but I'll just go to hell. And boy, that hit me really, really hard. And among many other things in that book.
Going back to Classics Illustrated, did you ever read about Tristan and Isolde?
Yes, I don't remember much about it though, but I did. Yeah.
So for the audience, Tristan and Isolde was a story written, I think it was like 1300s or something like that.
Very old.
Very old. But it like blew across Europe like a firestorm because it was a story about it was like a princess who was due to be married, and she wasn't in love with the guy she was supposed to be marrying, prince from someplace. And so she went to somebody to get a love potion made. They made the love potion, and somehow this other person, Tristan, ends up drinking the love potion by accident, or they both do, or something like that, and they fall in love with each other. And I forget the exact phrase, but basically what they do is when they profess love for each other, they say that if this means going to hell, I accept that.
Yeah.
Because that's how much I'm in love with you. And it's funny that the way that you worded this reminded me very much of that.
Well, I bet Twain was aware of it.
I'm sure he was aware of it.
He was a big reader, and he read. And that's the thing too, is I always tell people who ask me for advice as writers, I said, don't just read the field you want to write in, and don't just read the stuff written in your time, and always understand that different times had different beliefs and different ways of social construction, and learn something from it.
Yeah. So gonna ask this pair of questions again. Start with the negative so I can end with the positive. Do you remember the last person you hurt?
Yeah, I had a weird incident happen. I was going into Walmart of all places, and there were two young men standing over by the baskets, the little push carts, and I was walking fast. I'm pretty good health, especially for my age, and I still teach martial arts. And I was going in, and the guy said, "You walk fast for an old guy." I said, "Yeah, I'm spry," just like that. And then all of a sudden, this guy just takes off running at me, and I'm thinking, and I just barely noticed it out of the corner of my eye. When he does, I sidestep and kicked him in the ankle, and it knocked him out. That nerve hit him so hard, he just knocked him out. And the other guy came over and grabbed him, held him up, and I said, "Are you in this too?" "No, I don't want. No, I'm not." And
smart man.
So I hurt him. Yeah. Now, what I figured out later was he was going to run up by me and drop down on one knuckle, because that's what he was trying to do, and show that he was going to race me. But when he did that abruptly, he fucked up, because I didn't know that.
And just charge somebody out of nowhere like that.
Yeah, and I just kicked him with the side of my foot in the ankle. I mean, I intended to do more, but it wasn't needed, because I hit that nerve so hard, and I think he'd probably never been hurt in any manner, shape, or form. So that's the last time I'm really aware of hurting somebody, at least physically.
Do you remember the last person you helped?
Yeah, but I don't want to talk about that, because it makes me sound I've helped people with money. Let's put it like that. I've helped people in need. I have made sure people had some things they needed. And, I don't count giving to charities, because you never know exactly who you help. But I do that too. But
giving directly like that is better.
I've done that, but I don't, I'm not going to name names or embarrass anybody.
No, of course not. The example is good enough.
Yeah. Any really scary dreams as an adult?
You did mention earlier you had nightmares as an adult, didn't you?
No, I said I didn't have many. I did have two. One of them became my novel, The Drive-In.
That's what you mentioned, yeah.
Yeah, and the other one, it was funny. I was talking to a friend of mine. He had a similar one. But one night I went to bed, and it was more like I was remembering I had murdered somebody, and I had a friend help me do it. And we buried that person. And years later, I just kind of had put it aside. And years later, I thought about it, and I thought, my God, I killed somebody. And then when I woke up, that dream was so real. For a little bit there, I thought, my God, why did I? Then I realized the friend I dreamed didn't exist. And the person I killed didn't exist. But that's probably the strongest I have ever felt a dream seeming real, and that it being close to nightmarish. And I had the dream for 2 or 3 nights in a row, that I had murdered this person. And it seemed so real. I thought, well, I'm being a fraud. I killed this person, and I've gone on with my life. that dream is, I feel like I'll probably use it somewhere as in something, a story.
Definitely use that.
Yeah. But that was one of the strongest dreams I'd ever had.
Wonder if there was something going on in your waking life at that time that you
Probably.
felt.
I think there's always something that's going on, like that. But I thought about that and I couldn't figure anything that related to that. There were some things. My wife has Alzheimer's. And so I took care of her at home for a little over 4 years, but she just kept, of course, it got worse and worse. And I had to pick her up, change her, and do all those things. It got to where I couldn't manage that as much because I'd rip my shoulders out due to martial arts and due to taking care of her. And it got so bad, we had to put her in a memory unit. Fortunately, it's just down the road, so I go see her easily and regularly. But it may have been that dream somehow came out of that. I don't know.
Well, what I was keying into was the phrase where you said you felt like a fraud, and I could see how that could potentially relate to your fears about, if you're having to put your wife into this memory unit, that, does it speak to the quality of your love for her or something like that?
Yeah. And the thing is, we got a good place for her, and my kids, they're just the best. They come and help and see her and all that. We take good care of her. But she's in the best place she needs to be, and she likes it there. She doesn't know that she's not home.
That's awesome.
And so we were fortunate. She never felt that way. And I waited till the last minute to do it, and probably should have done it a little earlier. But I tried to take care of her as much as I could so that wouldn't be the case. And of course, it turns out she's better off there in the last few months when she was home, because she was much harder to take care of. I had a person I hired to come help me 3 hours for 3 days a week, but that wasn't enough, and eventually we found a place and it was expensive, but fortunately I have money and it was worth it. So we have her in a good place.
Good.
That's good.
So the next question is going to be over your entire life, and it's not going to be just related to horror. It could be any genre. Normally we would ask, what movie have you watched more times than any other? But being a literary person, I guess we could also accept, what book have you read more times than any other?
Well, strangely enough, it would be, and I haven't read it in years now, but I used to reread it every year from the time I first discovered it as a kid, and it was A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. I always felt that I wanted to be a writer, but when I read him at 11, I had to be a writer. Now, a lot of his work has dated somewhat, and I don't reread it now. I think I've sort of in some ways outgrown it, but it is probably my sentimental favorite. After that, To Kill a Mockingbird, which I used to read every year, but mostly short stories are what I love. And so I constantly reread short stories.
Not familiar. Well, first of all, let me clarify. Did you say prince or princess?
Princess.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Princess, you're not familiar with that?
Well, I thought I heard of one that was Prince of Mars, but I don't remember Princess.
The Princess of Mars.
Yeah, is her name Joanne Carter?
John Carter.
Yeah, I was joking.
Yeah, they made a movie called John Carter a few years ago that was originally called A Princess of Mars, which it should have been. And then there was a ripoff movie called A Princess of Mars that came out around the same time with Tracy Lords. And
oh God,
it wasn't a porno movie, but it was certainly a low budget movie.
Right.
And
of course.
But
oh God, Tracy Lords, sir, she is a legend.
Yeah. Whatever happened to the movie, it didn't do well, and it partly was the advertising campaign was awful. The movie wasn't that bad, but the problem was that so much of Burroughs has already been borrowed. I went and saw Avatar, that first one, and I thought, hell, this is borrowed from Burroughs, all of this, and because he wrote many books.
That's an original film.
Yeah, it's and then Tarzan is his other creation.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I actually finished one of his Tarzan books that he had left unfinished in the safe for 50 years. And they hired me to do that, and it was a great treat. I wrote a Tarzan novella for Edgar Rice Burroughs' company, and I wrote a John Carter of Mars short story. And I've been asked to do others. I personally just don't have the time because I've got other books. I'm working on this Happy Leonard. I've got a memoir to finish, and I got some scripts to do. I got some film things, and so and comic book things. So I'm a busy dog.
No time for writing because you're too busy writing.
Yeah, my daughter and I have a comic book series out right now from Dead Sky called Case of the Bleeding Wall, which is based on a story that we wrote that was part of a series of stories about the same characters that was in a book called Terror is Our Business.
I like the title Terror is Our Business, too.
Right.
So what did you like about Princess of Mars?
Well, as a kid, it was obviously about adventure and the fact that Deja Thoris, the heroine that he meets on Mars, is naked. That was really appealing. Everybody on Mars is nude, and that was a very controversial thing for the time in which it was written. And when I read those books, my librarian had to, and I was a kid, 11 or so, librarian in Gladewater had to give me special permission because they were considered adult books.
Call home and talk to your mom.
Yeah.
Kids, get your parents' permission.
Well, she said, look, just don't tell anybody, but you can read these if you want. And I said, oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah. What do you like? It's got naked women in it.
Of course.
But it really was the adventure and the incredible creations that he had on that planet. And he wrote a Venusian series, and he wrote a Center of the Earth series, at the Earth's core. And all kinds of great stuff for a kid.
So if Princess of Mars was the one that you've read most often, what would you say is your favorite book or movie? Because it may not be the one you've read most often.
Yeah. Favorite movie might be the adaptation of To Kill a Mockingbird. If it's not that one, it's Casablanca or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Book, it's hard to pick one book. God, I love so many books. I love... short story collection by Flannery O'Connor. My favorite book is To Kill a Mockingbird.
Okay.
That's dealt with so many things that I was dealing with growing up, even though it took place 20 years earlier, because things weren't much different where I lived than they were when she wrote that.
I'm trying to remember. Was that the one that had not George.
Gregory Peck?
No, I'm thinking of the guy that had
that's John Steinbeck.
Yeah, it's Of Mice and Men.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, the big brute in Kill a Mockingbird was Boo Radley.
Boo Radley, yeah. And it was played by Robert Duvall in the film.
Yep. And the father was played by Gregory Peck,
Gregory
who
Peck.
always talks like he's angry.
So if I'm thinking of the other book, then please refresh my memory on To Kill a Mockingbird.
What do you want to know?
Brief synopsis, because I'm drawing a blank on which one that one was.
What happened takes place in the 1930s. It's told by Scout, who is a little girl, and her brother Jim. And what they're doing is experiencing growing up in the city where there's it's a town where this black man is being accused of a rape that they pretty much pretty much know he did not do it. Right. But it's Gregory Peck is a lawyer that defends him in court. And it's very, very powerful. And he loses.
Yeah,
because
I'm tracking now.
Is more powerful than what he's trying to accomplish.
I'm tracking now.
Yeah,
I'm tracking now. Like Chris pointed out, I was thinking of Mice and Men. I was getting my wires crossed.
Also a good book, a very good book.
Yeah. Steinbeck.
And there have been several good adaptations. My favorite was the Lon Chaney Jr. adaptation, where he played the not so smart guy.
So this would normally be the spot where we would talk about the common themes that keep cropping up, and then maybe talk about how that intersects with horror. I think that you gave a really good summary actually already in the call when you mentioned storms, dogs, and defense.
Yeah, but you'd have to say include civil rights and Vietnam in that as well.
Right. That's part of the defense.
I was just about to add. I started to write down civil rights as a fourth item, but like Chris says, you could almost summarize that under defense in a way.
Yeah.
So normally the follow-up question there would be, why are those things important to you? I think we've already talked on that. And then the next question after that is, why horror? Because couldn't you address those things in other genres?
I do address it.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah.
You have shared that as well. I guess maybe in your case, then what I would ask as a follow-up is, what elements of those things do you think you can touch on in horror that you can't touch on in other genres? Like, is there a certain aspect of those things that you can't reach as well in the other genres?
I think horror. The emotion of horror is hard to do, and I think horror allows that emotion of discomfort and terror to be best realized. But you can actually do it a lot in other genres. I don't think there are limitations to the genres. I just think horror lends itself to that a little better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a fair point.
Yeah,
I don't love horror more than other things, but I love horror as much as other things.
Right. You're not the first guest that has shared that. We have had a few, particularly I remember Ken Anthony, who was in the similar vein as that.
Yeah.
No, we've had some guests who just don't like horror at all. They just happen to direct 1 or 2 horror movies.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I don't read much horror. I used to, but most of the time a publisher will send it to me, or occasionally a writer will ask, will you look at this and give a quote if you like it? But really, most of what I read is not horror. It's crime. It's historical. It's nonfiction. It's literary short stories. And I mean, I think that it's hard for horror to work for me anymore unless it's really unique.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've got a pretty good summary for everything here for you. Do you think there was anything that was relevant that we haven't talked about, or did maybe you thought of something early in the conversation and the conversation took a left turn?
No, not that I can think of. I think you did a pretty good job covering a lot of things.
Thank you. Well, we appreciate your time. Before we hit the closing here, do you want to again let everybody know what you're currently working on?
Yes, I am currently writing a book called The Hatchet Girls, which is a Hap and Leonard novel. And it's a follow-up to the last one. It's part of a series, but Sugar on the Bones is coming out in July, and this is coming out. I also have a Lovecraft story collection coming out where all the stories are somehow related to Lovecraft's work.
Oh, I will be keeping an eye out for that.
Yeah, it's called In the Mad Mountains.
Well, again, thank you for your time, and to anybody out there listening. Yep. What's that?
I said thank you.
Our pleasure. I'll get together with you offline to put together a bio page for you on our website and link to whatever it is that you want to link to. So I'll follow up with you for that. And then to anybody out there listening, if you want to find out more about what Joe's doing and get together with him, you can come to our webpage and look for his episode on our episodes page. And if anything else, tell a friend.
Yeah, so, and watch for the movie The Thicket coming out. I haven't seen it, so I'll experience it when you do.
Sounds like good.
I will be keeping an eye out for that as well. The Thicket.
Peter Dinklage and Juliette Lewis.
Yeah, that's right.
Should be good.